My brother and I built this cattle panel greenhouse in the summer of 2022. In this video, I will be going in depth on all the steps we took to put it together. Before I get into that, I want to mention that I put together some step-by-step plans for this build, and the link to the PDF is in the description of this video. There's also a material list in the description as well, and this is interactive if you download it, so you can play with the quantities. If you have a lot of these items already, like we did, you can take them out and kind of get an idea of what your price is going to be. There's an optional section on this list. You don't have to put metal on the bottom or stain any of the lumber, but if you're interested in that or you wanted to, there's pricing for all that as well. We started with the anchor points, put one in the ground. Once it was plumb, we measured off of that. We're on unlevel ground, so it's a little bit tricky. All of our anchor points are different lengths because of how unlevel our ground is. If you're on level ground, they could all be the same. We leveled everything off our first anchor point to ensure that everything is the same height, so the cattle panels will sit flush on them in the later steps. So there's our first wall, and we just made our way around, putting in plumb anchor points and leveling off our top crossbars. We put our bottom cross braces on level because we're attaching metal to the bottom. If you're doing plastic, you'd want to run it right across the ground, and if you're on level ground, it would be level anyway. Now that the base is done, it's time to attach the cattle panels. First thing I did was I put a support every 50 inches. I left an inch gap on all these supports to give the cattle panel a place to sit on. We're using plumber strap to attach the panel to the base. So now I grab the panels, I place the panels on the support on one side and bend them over to the support on the other side. There is a little bit of tension here, so be careful. But once it's in place, I went through with plumber's strap and secured it to the top cross brace. I repeated this process 2 more times until I had the first 3 cattle panels in place. As I was doing this, I was going through and zip tying all the panels together. The 4th panel needed to be cut before it was put into place. The Sawzall worked really well for that. The dimensions of our greenhouse worked out to where you just had to cut the 2 small sections of the cattle panel off and it fits perfectly. We got the 4th panel put in place and it's on to the end walls. For the end walls, we ran a board on the bottom on each side, and we marked the midpoint on the top cross beam on each side. We counted off the midpoint on the cattle panel and hung our makeshift plumb bob from that point, and I lined it up with our mark on the top of the board, and my brother plumbed out the doorway and attached it to the top and bottom crossbar. This turned out to be the trickiest part of the whole build. There's a lot of moving parts that you have to get lined up. Once it was secured on the bottom, we attached it to the cattle panel using more plumber strap. Once both sides were done, I cut the middle with a Sawzall to create the doorway. Same process on the other side, and once I was completed with that, I attached my header. Quick note on the header, since everything up to this point was level and the cattle panels are uniform, I was able to butt the header right up against 2 bars on the cattle panel, which gives it another layer of support, and the header was still level. To cut off a lot of the excess, you just run your Sawzall along the metal. Make sure you're not cutting into the metal. I did that once. It's not too big of a deal, but can't be doing it too many times. Once your header's done, it's time for bracing. We wanted to try a couple different styles out, and we alternated on each side. One side was angled and one side was more square. I like that we alternated our bracing because the square seems to help with the pressure coming straight down, and the angled seems to help with the pressure pushing in. It seems to help with the snow load. I'm recording this in the middle of winter, and we've had a few huge snowstorms, and this thing seems to handle it very well. We repeated the process on the other side. We just switched which side the angle and the squares were on. Then you're ready for your ridge beam. I found the midpoint of our header and measured the distance from the header to the cattle panel to make these supports. We left a space of 3.5 inches on one side of the support to set the ridge beam in. We got the board in place, screwed it to our supports, and sawed off the excess. It was important for us to have a ridge beam and a support for the ridge beam, which we're going to be doing next, because we're in the northern United States. We have long winters, a lot of snowfall, and we want this thing to be around for a long time, so we really wanted to build it in a way to where it's able to stand up to a lot of snow load. So speaking of the support for the ridge beam, what we did was we went into the woods. We found a tree that was blown over from a tornado earlier in the year, and I cut this log out of the tops. I drug it back to the cattle panel, and I started to cut a little notch in the top of the log for the ridge beam to sit in. We used a log because that's what we have at our disposal, but in our plans and in the material list I put together, I used a 4x4 for this. Now that the notch is ready to go, I dug a hole in the center of my ridge beam, and I slid the log in the hole, and I tipped it up until the ridge beam was sitting in the notch. And once it was in there, I kind of hit it to where it was sitting as flush as possible, and I put a couple screws in. So at this point, everything's framed out, and the next thing we're doing is attaching the metal to the bottom. We snapped a chalk line, measured from the chalk line to the ground, and cut each piece individually. This part is optional. We opted to put metal on the bottom because we had a lot of metal lying around. But if you want to save some money, you can just put plastic all the way down to the bottom baseboard. We're getting towards the end here. The next step is putting the plastic on. I rolled out my roll of plastic and I cut it to length. I left 8 feet on each side, but you might want to leave a little bit more if you're not having any metal and it has to go to the ground. You also want to make sure that you're putting something at the end of the cattle panels to protect the plastic. We had UV protected tape, so that's what we used, but if we had to redo this, I think we would end up using some sort of pipe insulators. We draped the plastic over the panels, and we used furring strips to secure the plastic to the top of the 2x4s. We made our way around the greenhouse, securing the plastic to the 2x4 using furring strips, and we cut off the excess plastic as we went. At this point, it's all coming together. This is the interior is going to look like. It's very roomy for the cost especially. I am very tall and I can stand up in here comfortably, so I'm very happy with how this turned out. I went and got some more furring strips and put them around the entirety of the greenhouse to really keep the plastic tight. Now that the plastic's all done, that just leaves the doors. We used some 2x3s and then used some furring strips and some metal we had laying around to secure plastic to them. We think we're gonna change these to 1x4s. We did this in our other greenhouse and we really liked how that turned out, but changing one thing about a build isn't too bad. And here she is, 16 by 10 foot cattle panel greenhouse. Step-by-step plans and detailed material list are in the description, and I plan on doing some winter update videos on this greenhouse soon.